I've got someone on my tail. Hukum's face contorted. There would be times where he would get an ominous feeling. He could have just chose to ignore it, but Hukum knows better than to just ignore his gut feeling. His prudence of following his intuition is one of the reasons why Hukum has managed to survive this far. Hukum had changed his course and erased his traces more delicately. But nevertheless, his anxiety did not go away. It wasn't something he could be sure of, not unless he could see it with his own eyes. Hukum trusted his senses. I'm sure someone's following me. He thought of the possibility that he might be tracked, but he didn't know that someone would really pursue him. Hukum felt a strong sense of crisis. All the way from Chengdu to this place, he really did his best to erase his traces. It should have been impossible for a warrior, even for those who had great tracking skills, to find and follow the traces he left behind. However, Hukum's confidence was shattered since someone indeed managed to follow him up to this point. It was clear that one who was following him had great tracking techniques. Were there such a person in Sichuan? Hukum bit his lip. There was only one person who came to mind. A person who ruined the plans he worked hard for. And the same person who killed Xiao Mun Pyong and instantly neutralized the collaborative work of Wan Jiayang and Nung Son. Hukum wasn't afraid of anyone, but the moment he saw him, goosebumps had run all over his body. It wasn't just because the man was strong. It was because he felt that he was a human being of his own kind, an existence who thrives in the dark and someone who doesn't hesitate to use any means to achieve his own purpose. A person who exerts more power when he's hidden than when he's exposed. Piawul. He's caught up. Piawul's reason for chasing him didn't matter. What matters is that Piawul is currently pursuing him. Shit. Hukum spit out swear words. If he was alone, he was confident that he would escape from Piawul's pursuit. But he had a burden called Wan Jiayang. With Jiayang on his back, it was impossible to completely evade Piawul's pursuit. However, it was not easy for him to just abandon or kill Wan Jiayang. If he did, all the painstaking efforts he had made so far would have been in vain. Above all, it doesn't seem likely that Piawul would give up chasing him even if he let go of Wan Jiayang. Hukum knows that Piawul is the kind of person who would chase his target even to the depths of hell. Perhaps, if Hukum had been in Piawul's position, he would probably have acted the same. So, Hukum had only one option left. It was to arrive at the Xiaolialian Temple in the shortest time. Xiaolialian Temple was his nest. Although he was not confident enough in dealing with Piawul alone, the Xiaolialian Temple was filled with monks who had a stronger force. No matter how strong Piawul is, he would not be able to deal with them all. With that being said, Hukum started running with all his power instead of wasting his time erasing his traces. Running with a person on his shoulder was not an easy task. Furthermore, what made it all the more difficult is traversing the snow-covered western plateau. But Hukum made the impossible possible with his superhuman patience and awareness. Finally, as he descended from the western plateau, a vast plain with no end in sight appeared. It was an incredibly dramatic change. But it was a familiar scene for Hukum. He had finally arrived in Zizing, which could be called his inner courtyard. They should be tired by the moment they escape from the mountains. The eyes of Hukum shone viciously. Asterisk. Jing Jianwu's appearance was a mess as he came out through the snow-covered forest. His clothes were torn everywhere, and his body was full of scratches from tree branches. He didn't feel any pain since it was just superficial wounds. But that didn't stop him from having a tired expression. He couldn't rest even for a moment because he was concerned about landslides and cliffs. But what bothered him more than anything else was the extreme cold. The severe cold that penetrated his bone was so painful that it was hard to bear, despite his strength and experience. The bitter cold gnawed at his stamina like an insect. It was only then that Jing Jianwu realized why the West Highlands was so notorious. He learned for the first time that going through a winter mountain without any preparations was almost close to suicide. The only reason he survived until now was because his internal energy was so deep. But if it had been anyone else, they would have frozen to death on the way. Jin Jianwu glanced at Pyowool. Pyowool's appearance was intact. From his appearance alone, it was hard to believe that Pyowool had actually passed through the snow-covered alpine region. I didn't know I would be so jealous, because of a mere cloak. Jin Jianwu looked at Pyowool's cloak with envy. The cloak made from oiled livestock perfectly protected Pyowool from the freezing cold. It allowed him to preserve his stamina and physical strength even when they were traveling. Thanks to this, Pyowool's body was in the best condition, despite the harsh journey. Jin Jianwu was exhausted from following such a pattern. Still, he never showed any signs of dislike. You'll discover the inception of this content at N0V at Ubin. It was because of Wen Jiayang. The sense of crisis that Hukum might do something untowards Wen Jiayang if he was late made him unable to rest. They passed through the western plateau and came down to the plains, but Pyowool continued the march without taking a proper rest. They had to maintain their distance from Hukum. The further away Hukum goes, the harder it will be for them to track him, no matter how strong his tracks remain. This is because nature could erase the traces of Hukum. A strong wind was constantly blowing on the plains. This made the grass on the plains only grow the height of a person's ankle. It was only a matter of time before the traces left on the ground were swept away by the wind, so before that happens, they had to catch up with Hukum as much as possible. They couldn't afford to take the time to rest. Pyowool persistently tracked down Hukum while Jin Jianwu helped by taking note of even the smallest traces he could find. Suddenly, Pyowool raised his head. A particularly strong wind was blowing. If they make a mistake, all the remaining traces of Hukum could be erased. If they lose Hukum here, it would become far more difficult to find the Xiaolialayan temple. The location of the Xiaolialayan temple is highly confidential, making it almost impossible for an outsider to find it without a guide. Not to mention, Pyowool and Jin Jianwu did not have a single information about the Xiaolialayan temple. Because of that, the two desperately followed the trail of Hukum. However, something happened that made the two stop their advance. A huge amount of dust was rising in the distance. A group of people were riding horses. Both Pyowool and Jin Jianwu possessed excellent eyesight. There was still a great distance between the two of them and the other party, but they quickly recognized the number and characteristics of those who came running on horseback. About 100 people in all. They are wearing a curved sword on their waist, which the warriors of Zizing mainly use. Jin Jianwu's eyes were cold. The warriors on horseback were running straight towards where they were. This could only mean that they were their target. He has started moving. Since the entirety of Zizing is under the influence of the Xiaolialayan temple, moving a group of bandits must not be that difficult for him. Jin Jianwu was convinced that the people running on horseback were bandits. It was the bandits and not the harsh natural environment, such as the rough wind, that brought great fear to the merchants. Bandits would swarm and plundered wherever they could. If they only took things away, they wouldn't have gained such notoriety. But besides goods, they also took people's lives. The vicious technique of leaving a few survivors left the merchants terrified even at the mere mention of their name. The bandits were closing the distance in an instant. At this rate, they will reach the two of them soon. Pyowool said to Jin Jianwu. You deal with them. Alone? If I wasted my time entangled against them, all his remaining traces would disappear. Even at this moment, the wind was blowing. It meant that all traces of Hukum were continuously being erased. Jin Jianwu asked, How will I find you? I'll leave a trace. All right. Jin Jianwu nodded without hesitation. With him accompanying Pyowool so far, he had come to know what kind of person Pyowool is, so Jin Jianwu was willing to follow his decision. Pyowool would clearly leave some trace that's easy to recognize. Therefore, he just has to do his part of fighting the bandits here so they wouldn't miss Hukum. Jin Gumwu's eyes had a cold glimmer. So far, he had no choice but to give the initiative to Pyowool. But that was only because tracking was not his forte. But everything changes when it comes to fighting. It was the area he was most confident in. There was no reason for him to show mercy a group of bandits. Jin Jianwu watched the group of bandits approaching rapidly and said, "I'll catch up with you soon." Pyeongwoo looked at Jin Jianwu for a moment and then moved. Like Jin Jianwu, there was no hesitation in Pyeongwoo's actions. There were things that Jin Gumwoo had to do, and there were things that he had to do. He should just do what he was best at. Pyeongwoo ran at frightening speed, leaving Jin Jianwu behind. By the time Pyeongwoo disappeared from Jin Jianwu's sight, a group of bandits started coming in and attacking. "Ha! Kill him!" They stormed towards Jin Jianwu with a terrifying force. Strong. At that moment, Jin Jianwu pulled out his sword. A dominating force bloomed like a cloud from his whole body. 9-ring heavenly sword, blood rain sword. 1. Skyak. The swordsmanship technique went and overpowered the bandits. And a scene from hell spread across the plains. ******. Pyeongwoo paused for a moment at the eerie feeling he felt behind his back. But he didn't look back. Pyeongwoo already knew even without confirming it with his own eyes that Jin Jianwu was going crazy. Goosebumps rose along his spine. The chi and technique that Jin Jianwu radiated was that frightening and fatal. He could see why Jin Jianwu managed to belong to one of the top-ranking experts in Jianghu. However, no matter how strong Jin Jianwu was, he would have to take a considerable amount of time to deal with all the 100 bandits. Pyeongwoo increased his speed. Jin Jianwu had seen Pyeongwoo's tracking speed so far and thought it was his best, but what he saw was actually not Pyeongwoo's true ability. Pyeongwoo was not foolish enough to show his true abilities in front of others. Now that he had shaken off Jin Jianwu, this was the perfect opportunity. Pyeongwoo started running at an unprecedented rate. The strong wind almost erased the faint traces, but it didn't matter. Pyeongwoo's nose could smell the scents carried in the wind. A dry wind with little moisture. There were also many scents mixed in it. To ordinary people, it would be just an unpleasant smell, but to Pyeongwoo, it was a reservoir of information. Pyeongwoo distinguished a sweet scent from among the numerous scents. "Found you." The scent was coming from Won Jae-young. Pyeongwoo wasn't sure how, but Won Jae-young smelled like sweet candy. Maybe it was her natural body scent, or it could be that she was influenced by her cultivation method, making her have that distinct scent on her body. Either way, it didn't matter to Pyeongwoo. Pyeongwoo remembered Won Jae-young's scent when she bumped into him. Thanks to her, even though her traces on the floor were gone, Pyeongwoo was able to track her down. Pyeongwoo sprinted in the direction the wind was blowing. Because the burden called Jin Jianwu was removed, Pyeongwoo's speed was doubled. No one was watching him, so he had nothing to be concerned about. Pyeongwoo sprinted across the plains like the wind. More and more, Won Jae-young's smell started to get stronger. This could only mean that the gap between him and Hukum was rapidly narrowing. In fact, he could already see someone moving in the distance. A black figure running while carrying someone on his shoulder. It was Hukum. However, Hukum did not notice at all that Pyeongwoo was near and just behind him. It was natural. Pyeongwoo completely concealed his presence. And Jin Jianwu, who was only a burden, was also removed. No matter how keen Hukum's eyes were, and no matter how good his senses were, it was impossible for him to notice the presence of Pyeongwoo. Pyeongwoo followed Hukum like a ghost. He thoroughly matched himself to Hukum's every action. Pyeongwoo would breathe at the same time as Hukum, and Pyeongwoo's heart would beat at the same rate as Hukum. Pyeongwoo basically synchronized his body with Hukum. It was one of Pyeongwoo's unique skills that no one could imitate. At this moment, Pyeongwoo was another Hukum. So Hukum did not notice Pyeongwoo at all, even though Pyeongwoo was directly behind him. Rather, it was another person who discovered Pyeongwoo. Won Jae-young, who was shaking helplessly on the shoulders of Hukum, raised her head and saw Pyeongwoo. Her eyes fluttered as if they were about to tear open. If Hukum had not restrained her, she would have screamed at that moment. Pale white face, insensitive eyes that show no emotion. It was as if a ghost was following them. Pyeongwoo.